First minority group to experience changes was the group that contained the disabled and the mentally ill. Dorothea Dix fought for the improvement of mental asylums so that the people in them were actually treated humanely. With Dix's efforts, a lot of reform for hospitals that housed the mentally ill occurred, and the residents of these hospitals gained several rights and were now treated as people.
After Mexico gained its independence from Spain, the Latino residents of California came to be known as Californios. By 1846, many Europeans and Americans had migrated to their region. Both the Californios and the Americans were able to coexist because both groups dominated different areas, ranching for the Californios and trading for the Americans. But that all changed when the gold rush occurred. Gold rush caused a large amount of immigration into the U.S. Two of the main groups that came into the U.S. to strike it big were the Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans. Both suffered from intense discrimination that occurred due to this large-scale immigration.
Asian Americans of this time were the Chinese, who came to America not only to start a new life and hopefully find gold, but also to escape the economic hardship in China due to the Opium War. These immigrants were not treated kindly by the Americans as they felt the immigrants were taking their jobs. One instance of this discrimination was shown through various laws like the foreign miner tax, which was essentially used to exclusively tax the Chinese.
The Californians suffered as various gold miners that came to California harmed their business. While the Californians languished, many other Latinos who were also experienced in mining came to California and had a small degree of success. This resulted in jealousy and some violence from the American settlers who felt the land was inherently theirs. They often ended up lynching Latinos. The majority of these Latino victims were not killed due to frontier justice. Only 64 of the approximately 597 victims were lynched in an area with a formal judicial system. Many of the victims were simply denied access to a trial or they were convicted of unfair trials.
After the gold rush, the Chinese found work in the Central Pacific Railroad, which aimed to build part of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Chinese workers were often forced to do the hardest and most dangerous jobs in this company. Approximately 1,000 Chinese workers died during the building of the railroad as a result of landslides and explosive accidents, which were caused as they dug through the Sierra Mountains. Even though they had the hardest jobs, the Chinese were still discriminated against, as they were only paid 60% of what the other immigrant railroad workers were paid. Whenever the Chinese tried to strike for better conditions or greater wages, they were often ignored and starved until they submitted and went back to work.
After the railroad was finished, the Big Four refused to recognize the work of the Chinese, and all of them were forbidden from appearing in the famous photograph of the ceremony that occurred when the two railroad lines met in 1869. After the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, many of the Asian workers returned to California, where they became the targets of more discrimination as they were now seen solely as an economic threat to white Americans. Thus began the anti-Chinese movement, where various Chinese people were lynched and murdered, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed, banning all Chinese immigrants into the U.S. and preventing any Chinese people from becoming U.S. citizens, even if the Chinese person was born in the U.S. This marked the first time that an ethnic group was singled out and forbidden from entering the U.S. This discrimination resulted in the creation of Chinatowns, which became the first safe haven of sorts for Asian Americans, as they provided a community that was always accepting towards them, due to a mostly Asian population being present in the towns.
During this time, many Latinos migrated into the U.S. due to various civil wars in Mexico. As a political move, Mexico was exempted from the quotas of the Immigration Act of 1924, which aimed to restrict the amount of immigrants traveling to the U.S. This resulted in a large influx of Latinos into the U.S. who expressed their faith and support in America and the American dream. In addition, this also foreshadowed the large leaps and bounds of rights that Latinos would gain in the coming World War II. During World War II, Latin Americans often volunteered to fight. Approximately 500,000 Latino men volunteered or were drafted to fight in the war. Enthusiasm for the war was very high in Latin Americans. Even at this time, there was a little discrimination against Latin Americans, and various riots, often dubbed the Zoot Suit riots due to the clothes that were worn by the young Latinos who participated in them, occurred as a result. These riots were short-lived, and they ended when the military servicemen moved out of the area. After the war, there were various benefits for Latinos, but the benefits were not as large for the Latinos as they were for white Americans. This led to a new level of activism that pushed for Latino equality. Whenever the Latinos saw unequal treatment, they protested and eventually gained rights to elevate their status. By the 2000s, most Latinos enjoyed rights equal to those of white Americans. While World War II was a time of improvement for many Latin Americans, it was a time of discrimination for most Asian Americans, mainly as a result of the Pearl Harbor bombing in 1941. In response to the bombing, Executive Order 9066 was passed, forcing at least 100,000 people of Japanese birth or descent to move into internment camps. However, by 1946, this discrimination was lessened with the Loose Cellar Act, which gave various opportunities for Indian Americans and Asian Americans to become citizens, as well as reestablishing immigration from those Asian countries. Over time, Asian Americans fought for and gained various rights, and the Japanese were eventually given an apology for the internment after the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. This marked the beginning of equal treatment for the Asian Americans, and it showed how they had succeeded in gaining rights and were now essentially equals with white Americans.
As time has progressed into the modern era, we see that new minorities have emerged, but in a different aspect. Now that this country has transcended the basics of the race barrier, we see minorities formed in social aspects. For example, take homosexuals. In the 21st century, they have taken a major stand in fighting for their rights as well as searching for social equality. The same goes for many religions in America, such as the Islamic faith, which has faced a lot of scrutiny since 9/11. One thing remains constant in the treatment of minorities. That is, why they are minorities. That they are isolated. They are made into their own group because they do not conform. And as long as society acts in such a manner where majority and conformity is correct, the minorities will always exist, and so will their treatment.